What if the giants who ruled before the flood didn't die in silence, but begged heaven for mercy first? Enoch recorded their plea word for word, and God's answer changed everything we think we know about judgment. Somewhere beneath the layers of sand and forgotten empires, there is a memory the earth itself seems unwilling to let go of. A memory of giants, not myth, not metaphor, but flesh and bone creatures who once walked across valleys that no longer exist, under a sky that watched them with growing sorrow. Genesis tells us plainly, there were giants in the earth in those days, and then, almost as an afterthought, adds that these were the days when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Most people read that verse and move on. But if you slow down, if you actually sit with what it says, you realize Scripture is handing you the edge of a much larger story, one that the Book of Enoch picks up and carries into places the Bible only hints at. The Watchers were never meant to walk among us. They were angels, holy sentinels stationed to observe the affairs of humanity from a distance, bound by obedience the way stars are bound to their courses. But something broke in them. 200 of them, led by a being named Semjaza, descended upon Mount Hermon and made a pact, an oath sealed in defiance, to take wives from among the daughters of men. Enoch records the moment with a kind of grief you can almost feel through the ancient language, because these were not casual unions. They were the beginning of an unraveling that heaven itself had not fully prepared for. Semjaza himself hesitated before that oath was sworn, according to the account preserved in Enoch's opening chapters. He feared he alone would bear the guilt of a plan that had not yet been carried out, and so he demanded the others bind themselves with him, curse for curse, so that no single watcher could claim innocence once the deed was done. 200 names are listed in that ancient record, leaders among them, teachers of forbidden knowledge who would go on to instruct humanity in the working of metals, the casting of spells, the reading of stars for purposes never intended for mortal hands. It is a chilling detail, because it shows this was not a single moment of weakness. It was a covenant of rebellion, deliberate and collective, entered into with open eyes. From these forbidden pairings came children unlike anything the earth had produced before. The Nephilim, giants whose height, according to the fragments preserved in the Book of Giants found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, reached numbers that defy ordinary human proportion. Some texts describe them growing so large so quickly that the natural world could not sustain their hunger. And that hunger became the hinge on which this entire tragedy turned. Because when the fields were stripped bare, when the herds were consumed, the giants did not stop. They turned toward humanity itself. Enoch writes that they began to devour men, and when men were no longer enough, they turned against one another, against birds, against beasts, against creeping things, even tasting blood in a way that defiled the very ground they stood on. Heaven was not silent through this. The text is clear that the cries of the oppressed rose up, that the earth itself, groaning under violence it had never known before, brought its complaint before the throne. This is where the story becomes something more than ancient horror, because these giants, these Nephilim, who had become instruments of ruin, were not without awareness of what was coming. The Book of Giants preserves something remarkable, something rarely spoken of even among people who know their Bible well. The giants themselves began to dream. 2 of them, Ohia and Hahia, sons of Semjaza, saw visions in their sleep that shook them to their core. Visions of a great tablet being washed, of gardens being destroyed, of a judgment they could sense approaching like weather on the horizon they could not outrun. This is what makes the story impossible to look away from. These were not simple monsters without understanding. They felt the weight of what their existence had become. They understood, in whatever capacity beings born of angelic transgression could understand, that something was ending. And in that understanding came desperation. According to the traditions preserved in Enoch and expanded in the Book of Giants, the giants pleaded. They sought a way to escape the coming judgment, sending word through Mahujia, one among them, to reach Enoch himself, the one man whose righteousness had made him a kind of bridge between the world that was and the world that was about to be swept away. Imagine that for a moment. Creatures born of rebellion, creatures who had devoured and destroyed without restraint, now turning in fear toward a mortal man, begging him to carry their plea before God. It tells you something about the nature of judgment in Scripture. It is never distant or careless. Even those who brought devastation upon the earth were given a moment where their voice could be heard. where their fear could be spoken aloud before the throne of the one who made them possible in the first place. Jude, writing centuries later in the New Testament, would look back on this same event and describe angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own habitation, now reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, unto the judgment of the great day. The echo of Enoch's account runs directly through that verse, connecting the oldest layers of tradition to the words the early church itself preserved as scripture-adjacent truth. What happened when that plea reached Enoch, and what answer came back from heaven, is where this story turns from tragedy into something almost unbearable in its weight. Because the response the giants received was not the response they expected, and it reveals something about divine mercy and divine justice that most people have never been taught in any church, on any Sunday, from any pulpit. That answer is what we are about to walk through together. If this kind of forgotten scripture speaks to something in you, something that has been searching for depth beyond the surface, take a moment now to subscribe to this channel. There is far more waiting here, more accounts drawn from the oldest witnesses of our faith, more truths the modern world has quietly set aside. And if you find yourself wanting to hold these revelations in your own hands, to read the full account of the Watchers, the giants, and the world before the flood at your own pace, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, was created exactly for that. It brings together everything Scripture only gestures toward, illustrated and organized so the full weight of this history finally makes sense. You will find the link waiting for you in the very first comment pinned below this video. Enoch was not a man who sought out visions. By his own account, and by the way later tradition remembers him, he lived a life set apart, walking with God in a manner so close that Genesis uses a phrase reserved for almost no one else in Scripture, simply saying that Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That closeness is precisely why the Watchers turned to him. They understood, even in their fallen state, that Enoch carried a kind of access they had forfeited the moment they broke their appointed order. So when Mahugia brought the plea of the giants, and when the Watchers themselves added their own desperate request, it was Enoch who found himself summoned into a vision, unlike anything a mortal had experienced before. He describes being lifted, carried by winds that set him down before a structure built of hailstones and tongues of fire, a house within a house, each more terrifying than the last, until he stood trembling before a throne of crystal, wheels turning like the sun, and a figure whose robe outshone the light itself. This was not poetic embellishment for Enoch. This was testimony, written by a man attempting to describe an encounter that stretched the limits of human language. Cherubim moved around that throne, and beneath it flowed something like rivers of fire, and Enoch admits plainly that he fell upon his face, his whole body trembling, until a voice called him forward by name. And it was here, in this place beyond ordinary sight, that the answer began to take shape. An answer he would have to carry back down the mountain and deliver to beings far older, far more powerful, and far more desperate than himself. The message he received was not what the Watchers hoped for. God's response, as Enoch records it, was that there would be no peace for them, not because mercy did not exist, but because the nature of what they had done could not simply be undone by asking. They were spirits holy by original design, meant to intercede for humanity, not to become entangled in its flesh. By taking wives and fathering the Nephilim, they had crossed a boundary that Scripture treats as fundamentally different from human sin. Human beings sin and are offered atonement, sacrifice, a path back. The Watchers had abandoned their spiritual estate entirely, and in doing so, they had removed themselves from the very mechanism by which forgiveness operates. Enoch was told plainly that they should have interceded for men, not sought intercession for themselves, and that the reversal of that order was itself the deepest wound in what they had done. But the answer went further, and this is the part almost no one discusses, even among those who have read Enoch cover to cover. It was not only about the Watchers, it concerned their children directly, the giants themselves, the very ones who had sent their plea through Mahugia with such desperate hope. God's answer declared that the spirits of the giants, though their bodies would perish in the judgment to come, would not simply cease to exist. Enoch was told that evil spirits would proceed from their flesh, because they were born of a union between spirit and matter that had no rightful place in creation, and so at their death, something would be left behind, something without a body, without a home, condemned to wander the earth. This is the origin, according to this ancient testimony, of the spirits that later scripture and centuries of tradition would come to call demons. Not simply metaphorical darkness, but the disembodied remnant of the Nephilim, restless because they no longer possessed the physical form their nature had once depended on. Think about what that means for the plea the giants had sent. They had begged for mercy, hoping perhaps for restoration, for a way to continue existing in the world they had already devastated. Instead, the answer confirmed that their physical destruction was certain, and that what would remain of them afterward would be worse than death, a kind of existence stripped of purpose, forced to roam among the ruins of the world they helped destroy, afflicting and corrupting because affliction and corruption were the only patterns left available to them. It is a sobering picture, and it reframes so much of what later scripture says about unclean spirits and demonic oppression. When Jesus, generations later, cast out spirits that begged not to be sent into the abyss, that pleaded for another place to go, the echo of this ancient account becomes almost impossible to ignore. These were not abstract evils invented by superstition. According to the world Enoch describes, they were the remnants of a rebellion that reached back to Mount Hermon, to the pact of 200 watchers, to a hunger that consumed an entire pre-flood civilization from the inside out. Enoch carried this answer back to the watchers himself, and scripture preserved in his book describes their reaction with unusual tenderness for beings who had caused so much ruin. They wept. They covered their faces, unable to look upon the one who brought them the verdict they feared most. Enoch writes that he read the message aloud to them as they sat together, and that from that moment, their hope died within them, because they understood there would be no undoing what oath and desire had already set into motion. It is one of the rare moments in ancient religious literature where the reader is asked to feel something close to sorrow for beings responsible for catastrophic evil, not because their actions are excused, but because the text refuses to reduce them to simple monsters. They are shown as beings who understood exactly what they had lost, and who grieved it with an intensity that mirrors, in strange and unsettling ways, the grief of humanity itself in the years leading up to the flood. This is the answer that history has largely forgotten, buried beneath centuries of theology that preferred simpler explanations for where evil in the world originated. But the account preserved through Enoch insists on something more layered, more disturbing, and ultimately more coherent with what we see written elsewhere in Scripture about spiritual warfare, unclean spirits, and the invisible conflict that Paul describes when he writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world. The Nephilim's plea was answered, but not in the way anyone, mortal or angelic, expected. And what happened next as the flood approached and the world these beings had corrupted began its final unraveling reveals just how far the consequences of Mount Hermon's broken oath were destined to reach. The world the Watchers and their children left behind was not simply corrupted in a moral sense, the way modern readers often imagine sin working quietly in private hearts. Enoch describes something closer to ecological collapse, a planet groaning under the weight of what had been unleashed upon it. Azazel, one of the leading Watchers, is singled out for a particular kind of blame in the ancient text, credited with teaching men the making of swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, along with the art of working gold and silver into ornaments that fed vanity and greed. He taught women the art of deception through appearance, the use of antimony to darken eyes, the beautifying of the face in ways meant to draw men into lust rather than covenant. What Genesis compresses into a single devastating sentence, that the earth was filled with violence, and every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, Enoch expands into a detailed account of exactly how that corruption spread, techne by techne, temptation by temptation, until nothing on the earth remained untouched. This is where the story intersects with something people rarely connect to Scripture at all. Across the ancient world, scattered from Anatolia to the Andes, there are structures whose age and engineering still confound modern archaeology. Göbekli Tepe in what is now southeastern Turkey predates known civilization by thousands of years, its massive carved pillars raised by people who supposedly had no cities, no writing, no organized labor force capable of such precision. Baalbek in Lebanon contains stones so enormous, some exceeding 800 tons, that even contemporary engineering struggles to explain how they were quarried and transported. Pumapunku in Bolivia, Sacsayhuaman in Peru, Yonaguni beneath the waters off Japan, all carry the same unsettling signature: construction on a scale and precision that seems to demand knowledge and strength beyond what conventional history assigns to the ancient peoples credited with building them. Local traditions surrounding several of these sites even preserve their own memories of giants and flood, oral histories that predate any contact with the biblical text, which only deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Whether or not every stone can be tied directly to the age of the Nephilim, the pattern is worth sitting with. Our pre-flood world remembered across nearly every ancient culture as having giants, heroes, demigods, beings of unusual size and capability, followed by a catastrophic flood myth appearing on nearly every continent, followed by ruins that still defy easy explanation. Heaven's patience, according to Enoch's account, had a boundary, and that boundary was reached. God did not simply allow the corruption to run its course unaddressed. 4 archangels are named as bringing the full report before the throne: Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel, each looking down upon the earth and seeing the blood being shed, seeing the oppression, seeing the teachings of Azazel spreading like infection through every tribe. It was Raphael who received the specific charge concerning Azazel, commanded to bind him hand and foot, to cast him into darkness, and to cover him with rough and jagged rocks in a place called Dudael, there to remain until the day of judgment, when he would be cast into the fire. Gabriel was sent against the children of fornication, the offspring of the Watchers, commanded to set them against one another in mutual destruction, so that the giants would not simply be swept away by flood, but would first turn their own violence against each other, shortening their days upon the earth before the waters ever came. Michael was given perhaps the heaviest charge of all, commanded to go to Semjaza and to his companions who had united with the daughters of men, and to bind them for 70 generations underneath the hills of the earth until the day of their judgment, until the consummation of all their wickedness. 70 generations is a staggering span, a sentence not of days or years but of ages, a punishment stretched across the entire remainder of human history up to the final reckoning, long enough that empire after empire would rise and fall over the ground beneath which they lay bound, unaware of what slept beneath their foundations. Reading this alongside the words Jude would later write in the New Testament, that God reserved these angels in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. The two accounts fit together like pieces cut from the same original cloth, one preserved in the fuller Enochian tradition, the other compressed into a single sentence by a New Testament author who clearly assumed his readers already knew the fuller story. And then there was Noah. Uriel, the 4th archangel, was sent specifically to warn him, to tell him what was coming, that the whole earth would be destroyed, that a deluge was about to cover everything, and that he alone, along with his family, had been found worthy to be preserved through it. This detail matters more than it might first appear. The judgment that swept away the Nephilim was not indiscriminate destruction born of divine frustration. It was precise, targeted, communicated in advance to the one righteous line still standing amid the wreckage of what the Watchers had built. Noah is described elsewhere in Genesis as perfect in his generations, a phrase some ancient commentators have connected to genetic purity from Nephilim corruption, though that reading remains debated among scholars. What is not debated is that Noah walked with God the same way Enoch had, and that this walk placed him outside the collapse, consuming everyone around him. It is worth noting, too, that Enoch himself was Noah's great-grandfather, and tradition holds that some of what Enoch received in his visions was passed down through the family line, a thread of preserved warning stretching from one righteous man to the next across generations that had otherwise given themselves fully to ruin. The flood, when it finally came, was not merely water rising over land. In the framework Enoch presents, it was the final mechanism by which heaven separated what could be redeemed from what could not. The giants, already weakened by the mutual slaughter Gabriel had set in motion among them, met their physical end in the waters, exactly as had been promised. But as we've already seen, their end was not truly an end. Their spirits, cut loose from bodies that could no longer contain them, became the wandering evil the world would carry forward long after the waters receded and Noah's family stepped back onto dry ground to rebuild a civilization that would never fully escape the shadow of what came before it. One detail in Genesis has troubled careful readers for centuries, and it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The verse does not simply say there were giants before the flood. It says, there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. Also after that. 4 words that quietly unravel the assumption most people carry, the assumption that the flood ended the Nephilim problem completely, washing the earth clean of that corruption in a single decisive act. If the giants were fully destroyed root and branch in the days of Noah, why would Scripture bother mentioning their continued presence generations later, long after the waters had receded and a new world had begun to take shape? The most straightforward explanation offered across ancient Jewish tradition is unsettling but consistent with everything Enoch has already shown us about how thoroughly this corruption had spread. If even one of Noah's daughters-in-law carried Nephilim bloodline into the ark, whether knowingly or not, the line would have continued on the other side of the flood. Some traditions point specifically at Ham's wife, Naamah, as a possible carrier of that lineage, though the sources disagree and the evidence remains genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is what Scripture records afterward. By the time the Israelites reached the borders of Canaan under Moses, giants were not a distant memory. They were a present and terrifying reality standing between God's people and the promise they had been given. The 12 spies sent into Canaan in the Book of Numbers returned with a report that shook the entire camp. They had seen the descendants of Anak, and they described themselves as grasshoppers in comparison, so overwhelming was the size of what they encountered. The Anakim, along with the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, appear scattered across Deuteronomy and Joshua under different tribal names, but the pattern connecting them is unmistakable. Communities remembered specifically for their unusual height and strength, feared by every surrounding nation, treated as remnants of something older and stranger than ordinary human genealogy. Moses himself, before his death, recounts defeating Sihon and Og, 2 kings whose territories east of the Jordan were known specifically as strongholds of this giant lineage, and the text takes noticeable care to record these victories in detail, as though the author understood how significant it was that ordinary Israelite forces, under divine favor, could overcome what other nations considered unconquerable. Og, king of Bashan, receives particular attention in Deuteronomy, where his iron bedstead is described with measurements stretching over 13 feet in length, a detail preserved almost as a museum artifact, proof offered to later generations that this was not exaggeration, but recorded fact. And then centuries later there is Goliath. Most people who grew up hearing the story of David and Goliath heard it as a simple lesson about courage facing impossible odds, a boy with a sling standing against an armored giant. But read within the framework Enoch and the broader ancient tradition provide, Goliath becomes something far more significant than a single oversized soldier. He is explicitly identified as being from Gath, one of the last strongholds where the descendants of the Anakim were permitted to remain after Joshua's conquest swept through the land. 1 Samuel describes his height at 6 cubits and a span, somewhere near 9.5 feet by most calculations, along with armor so heavy that Scripture bothers to record its weight in shekels, a detail no author includes, unless the point is specifically to emphasize how far beyond ordinary human capacity this figure stood. David's victory then was not merely a triumph of faith over intimidation. It was, in a very literal reading of the text, the defeat of a living remnant of the very bloodline that had provoked the flood in the first place, a small but symbolically massive echo of the judgment that had been pronounced against the Nephilim generations earlier. This pattern, giants surfacing again and again at key turning points in Israel's history, suggests something the modern church rarely teaches from the pulpit, that the conflict described in Genesis and expanded in Enoch was never fully resolved in a single flood. It was contained, pushed back, its most immediate threat drowned beneath the waters, But the underlying spiritual and even physical corruption persisted in scattered form for centuries afterward, requiring conquest after conquest, battle after battle, to keep it from spreading again the way it had in the world before Noah. Paul's language in Ephesians about wrestling against principalities and powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places, takes on additional weight when read against this backdrop. The war did not end at Mount Ararat. It simply changed shape, moving from open giants walking across the land to the unseen spiritual battle Scripture insists continues even now. There is something almost merciful, though, buried within this long and difficult history, and it deserves to be said plainly. Every time Scripture records a victory over these remnants, whether through Joshua's conquest, through David's sling, through the judgment pronounced by Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel against the original Watchers, the message underneath is consistent. No corruption, however ancient, however deeply rooted, stands beyond the reach of divine justice. The same God who heard the cries of the oppressed rising up before the flood is the God who continued answering that cry generation after generation, refusing to let the pattern of violence and domination win permanently, even when it kept resurfacing in new forms across centuries of human history. Josephus, writing his history of the Jewish people in the 1st century, references these same giants matter-of-factly, describing men of prodigious size whose bones, he claims, remained visible in his own day as evidence of what had once walked the earth. He was not a mystic or a fringe writer prone to exaggeration. He was a trained historian, familiar with Roman and Jewish sources alike, and his willingness to record these details without hedging or apology suggests that in his era, the existence of such beings was simply accepted background knowledge rather than a controversial claim requiring defense. Whether or not modern readers accept every detail of his account, the fact that a serious historian writing centuries after Moses treated this as established fact rather than legend tells us something about how differently the ancient world understood this history compared to how it gets dismissed today. What we are left with, piecing together Genesis, Enoch, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Samuel, and the account preserved by Josephus, is not a single isolated myth, but a thread running consistently through nearly the entire span of biblical history. A thread that began with a broken oath on Mount Hermon and never fully disappeared, no matter how many centuries passed or how many kingdoms rose to try and forget it. There is a reason Jesus, standing on the Mount of Olives centuries after Noah, chose the flood specifically as his comparison when his disciples asked him about the end of the age. He did not reach for Sodom, though that story was available to him. He did not reach for the plagues of Egypt. He said, "As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away." On the surface, this reads as a simple warning about complacency, about people going through ordinary life while missing the signs around them. But when you place this statement alongside everything Enoch and the wider ancient tradition preserve about what actually happened in those days before the flood, the warning gains a second layer that most readers never notice. The days of Noah were not simply days of moral laxity, the way modern sermons often flatten the comparison. They were days of active supernatural corruption, days when the boundary between heaven and earth had been deliberately violated, days when beings never meant to interact directly with humanity had crossed that line and reshaped the entire trajectory of the world through their offspring. If Jesus is telling his followers that the end of the age will resemble those specific days, the implication is not merely that people will be distracted by weddings and dinners. It is that the same kind of spiritual breach, the same blurring of boundaries that should never have been crossed, will characterize the final period before his return. This is a heavier reading than most churches are prepared to sit with, and yet it fits far more naturally into the rest of Scripture's own testimony than the softened version most congregations receive on a Sunday morning. Paul seems to echo this same expectation when he writes to the Ephesians about wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against rulers of darkness and spiritual forces in high places, language that assumes an active, ongoing conflict rather than a settled historical footnote. Revelation, the final book of the New Testament, carries this thread even further, and it does so using imagery that lines up with startling precision against the Enochian material. John describes a war in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon and his angels being cast down to the earth, their place found no more in heaven. The same archangel who bound Semjaza beneath the hills of the earth for 70 generations appears again, still engaged in the same essential conflict, still the appointed instrument of heaven's justice against rebellious spiritual powers. Revelation also describes locusts released from the bottomless pit during the tribulation, creatures with the faces of men, the hair of women, the teeth of lions, empowered by a king named Abaddon, whose name in Hebrew means destruction. These are not ordinary insects in any natural sense, and John himself seems to strain for language adequate to describe them, reaching for comparisons that combine human, animal, and something else entirely, something outside ordinary categories of creation. Many ancient interpreters have connected this imagery directly back to the spirits of the giants Enoch described. The disembodied remnant of the Nephilim finally released in full force during the final years before judgment, completing a cycle that began at Mount Hermon and closes only at the return of Christ himself. What makes this connection so compelling rather than simply speculative is how consistently the numbers 7 and 70 appear across this entire narrative arc. 70 watchers are named as the primary offenders in some manuscript traditions. 70 generations mark the length of Semjaza's binding. 70 nations are traditionally understood to have descended from Noah's sons following the Table of Nations in Genesis. Daniel later receives a prophecy measured in 70 weeks of years, determining the full span of Israel's history until Messiah is cut off. Even the number of elders appointed to assist Moses in the wilderness echoes this same pattern. 70 men set apart to bear the weight of leadership and judgment among the people. The pattern suggests a divine architecture running underneath the entire biblical narrative, a structure where judgment, restoration, and final reckoning are measured out with an intentionality that resists dismissal as coincidence. Whether or not every connection holds up under detailed scholarly scrutiny, the sheer density of these parallels across Genesis, Enoch, Daniel, Numbers, and Revelation deserves far more attention than mainstream teaching typically gives it. This is where the story returns finally to the plea the giants sent so long ago, the desperate hope carried by Mahujaah to Enoch, asking for a mercy that never came in the form they wanted. Their bodies perished in the flood, exactly as had been decreed. Their spirits were loosed into the world exactly as Enoch had warned, and according to the picture Revelation paints, those same spirits, or spirits very much like them, are destined to resurface one final time before the age closes, released briefly, permitted one last terrible expression before being shut away permanently in the judgment that awaits every power that ever set itself against heaven's order. The plea for mercy was answered, not with restoration, but with a sentence stretched across the entire span of human history, a sentence that began at Hermon and will not fully close until the final trumpet sounds. For those who have followed this story from the beginning, from the oath sworn by 200 watchers to the visions Enoch carried up the mountain and back down again, there is something worth sitting with here. Scripture does not present a universe indifferent to cruelty, nor one where evil simply wins by outlasting justice. Every thread we have traced, the corruption of the pre-flood world, the binding of the watchers, the resurfacing of giants among Israel's enemies, the war described in Revelation, points toward the same conclusion. Judgment delayed is not judgment denied. The same God who heard the cries rising from a world devoured by giants is the same God John describes wiping away every tear, making all things new, closing the book on a rebellion that stretched back further than most believers realize their own faith already accounts for. And perhaps that is the deepest comfort hidden inside a story that otherwise reads as pure warning. That no matter how ancient the wound, no matter how far back the rebellion reaches, nothing lies beyond the patient, unhurried reach of divine justice finally set right. Thank you for walking through this ancient plea with us, from the oath at Mount Hermon to the answer that echoes still in Revelation itself. If this story moved something in you, Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling us which part struck you hardest. A like helps this reach others still searching for these forgotten truths. And if you want to hold this entire history in your hands, illustrated and fully unpacked, our premium guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is waiting in the pinned comment below. Everything the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood still have to reveal. Stay close. More is coming to your screen right now.